This is Paige Arthur. I'm the Deputy Director at the Center on International Cooperation, and I lead all of our work on prevention and peace building. And I just want to say a few words of welcome and to thank all of you for joining. We have now been hosting these Data for Peace dialogues since October 2020. And in terms of registrations, this is the largest group we've ever had. So it's a positive sign that this community of practice that we're trying to build is really starting to take root. And I wonder if many of you may have heard about these dialogues after participating in the international workshop that we did last month on early warning and early action. So we welcome you if you are new. This is your first time at one of these dialogues, but also we will be sharing out more information about kind of the last pieces of that early warning, early action workshop, because we're just in the process of uploading all of the videos that people will be able to access if you weren't able to join all of those sessions. So again, welcome to everybody. I wanted to especially welcome Katerina Höhne, who's the Director of Research at Diplo Foundation, and of course, Danish Masood, who is the cell co-lead at the co-lead of the DPPA Innovation Cell at the United Nations. I'm really pleased to have both of you here today to talk about the future of mediation and peacemaking with emerging technologies. I mean, this issue of finding new ways to conduct mediation has been crucial over the last decade, especially as conflict has been transforming, and therefore the means to ending conflict has also been transforming. But I think it's ever more urgent with the specific challenges and pressures that the COVID-19 pandemic has placed upon mediation and peacemaking. Sorry, I just lost my screen. In any case, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really kind of changed the context for doing peacemaking and mediation, and created new challenges. And perhaps we'll hear a little bit about that from Katerina and Danish today. But I think there's so much innovation happening in this space. I'm really eager to hear from the speakers and to get their updates. So I'm going to hand over to Branka Panic now. Over to you, Branka.
Thank you, Paige, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome from my side as well to another of our peace dialogues. I am Branka Panic, and I am a resident fellow at University discussion today. Today's webinar is actually 7th monthly event that we are organizing. So we have a lot to reflect on, but we are also reflecting on this previous pandemic year that placed us all in this sort of a tech-driven world surrounded by emerging technologies, as Paige mentioned. So with this lens of emerging technologies, but also pandemic, we are looking into this interesting topic today, which is mediation and peacemaking. And the field of mediation is usually considered as a so-called low-tech field, where emotions and emotional intelligence, communication skills, interpersonal skills have a high value. Well, this field is now put in front of a challenge of functioning with these new technologies, but also maybe proactively exploring the potential benefits. So we recognize, of course, that this intersection of emerging technologies and mediation and peace processes is not new, but we also recognize, and I'm mentioning this again, that the pandemic did emphasize this urgent need, while also revealing many additional challenges that come with this new, I don't know how to call it, pandemic or post-pandemic world, depending from which part of the world probably you are joining us from. And looking at conflict parties and peacemaking actors, different actors, we see that they already increasingly use online tools to express their voices. And with this, large amounts of data are already produced, which is opening new possibilities, maybe of even processing this data, this voice or text, and gathering some new insights that we didn't have before. Different technologies under this artificial intelligence or AI umbrella can offer us support in gathering and analyzing the existing data and the data produced in the peace processes. But it's not only about actors in peacemaking and mediation. It's not only about states or mediators. It's also about citizens themselves. So some tools can bring the perspective of civilian. Potentially, we will see from our speakers today if those tools can bring maybe perspectives from civilians as well to the table, maybe even enable more inclusion, or maybe even what some are calling bringing more democratization into the entire process with these new tools. Although many of the practitioners think that mediation is and should stay what we can call a human or exclusively human-centered. Others on the other side are envisioning this future of the field with emerging technologies, and some of them are really, for many of us in our work, even this future forecasting. We are not using them yet, but we want to maybe think with our guests today how we can even use virtual or augmented reality in this work, and of course, what are the risks that are coming with this. At the same time, we are also recognizing that data never comes without politics, and the technology is not only a tool, the technology is different. So we will also look into current and future risks that are coming with all of these technologies, and even which comes over and over in the discussions that we have at Data for Peace Dialogues, even introducing some new forms of digital activism into this work, and then we will try together to see how we can, what are the responses to these potential risks. So once again, I'm thrilled to be joined by our panelists today, by our guests. So welcome again, for those of you, I see that people are still joining. So welcome once again to the Future of Mediation and Peacemaking with Emerging Technologies panel session. And welcome again to our dear guests today, Katarina and Danish. When we were preparing for this session, we decided to start with Katarina's introduction. So Katarina is leading a Diplo Foundation research on general data diplomacy. She will set the scene for our conversation today. And Katarina is also an author of the paper. I wanted to mention this paper on mediation and artificial intelligence, notes on the future of international conflict resolution. And when we were preparing our work and our report that we published last year on data-driven approaches to peace building and prevention, we used this paper extensively. So I can't find a better person to start this conversation and to help us understand not only the future, but also the present of these technologies and how are we already utilizing them or how we can think about utilizing them in the future. So first, before I give floor to Katarina, just another quick housekeeping rule to the audience, a reminder for those who are joining us regularly, but also an introduction for those who are joining us the first time. So we usually start by giving more time to our speakers to cover in depth some of the issues that they are working in. So Katarina and Danish will first share their work, and then we will leave some time for questions and answers at the end. But in the meantime, please feel free to also introduce yourself in the chat and slowly start typing your comments and questions to our speakers. I will do my best to summarize these questions, to pick them up at the end, and to really make sure that we have an interesting discussion towards the end of the session. So with this, I'm leaving the floor to Katarina to start. Welcome, Katarina.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm more than thrilled about the invitation and about being able to speak. So thank you so much. Also, thank you for the perfect introduction. So again, my name is Katharina Höhner. I'm the Director of Research at Diplo Foundation. Perhaps a little bit of context for you about Diplo Foundation to then also put what I'm going to say afterwards into context. Diplo Foundation is a not-for-profit based in Geneva. We also have offices in Malta, Belgrade, and Washington, DC. And we kind of work at the intersection of digital technology and diplomacy. And in our work, we're standing on two legs, which one leg is capacity building and training at this intersection of diplomacy and digital technology. And the other leg is on research. And of course, both of them feed into each other. It was really great to see in the introduction this mention of the pandemic, of the COVID-19 kind of context, because I think what we've seen there is that diplomats, generally speaking, and of course also mediation experts, have proven to be very adaptable. The question now, of course, is how these tools that are now becoming more prominent in the practice will have a longer term impact on the practice and will be used in a more sustainable way over the longer duration. The other point that is really interesting and relevant for the conversation here is the fact that diplomats needed to negotiate the use of the tools or the tools themselves while solving very pressing, urgent, and critical issues. So this kind of juxtaposition of, on the one hand, there are real pressing issues to be solved. On the other hand, at the same time, we are negotiating the tools we're using to solve them. And that became very prominent in the pandemic, but I think it's also the underlying theme of the situation we're in right now. And I think it's also a theme that is only going to continue to become more stronger in the future. But with having said this, I want to get a bit more into the topic, and I have a presentation to share. So here we are. Just a bit for context. So here's one of the papers that Branka already kindly mentioned. We also did a larger mapping study on diplomacy in general and artificial intelligence, but I would be amiss not mentioning other papers which are really relevant in this area. So if you're not familiar with, we have the E-Analytics Guide and Digital Technologies and Mediation in Armed Conflicts. In both cases, UN DPPA was very prominent in, was one of the organizations behind these papers. So that just for context. I want to start with another kind of mapping exercise, which is the question very broadly, and in my presentation, I'm going to focus on artificial intelligence in particular, how to think of AI and negotiations very broadly. So at Diplo, the typology we're often using to make sense of digital tools and diplomatic practice is what you see on the screen here is, on the one hand, we have new topics that are emerging that diplomats need to deal with, topics related to AI governance, ethics, lethal autonomous weapons, so a whole host of new topics. But then AI, of course, is also a tool for negotiation. And this is what I'm going to focus on in the following in the context of mediation. But then there's another important point, I think, which is that artificial intelligence also impacts the environment in which negotiations and in which mediation takes place. We can think of this in terms of the AI arms race or the potential AI arms race between the US and China. We can also think of this of a context of negotiation and mediation, which is increasingly complex and insecure due to fake news, for example, or a very accelerated exchange of information. So that's important to keep in mind. And at Diplo, we use a lot of illustrations to make these points. So here is one of those illustrations. So we have mediation, and then we have all the tools which can support mediation, among them social media, artificial intelligence, all these kind of things. But then there's also the larger social context in which all of this takes place, which again is impacted by these digital technologies. So this just as a framework. What I want to do now is share with you 4 examples, which I think really exemplify how AI tools become relevant for mediation, for negotiation in general, but also mediation in particular. The first tool has to do with questions around preparation for negotiation or preparation for mediation. The tool I always like talking about is called the Cognitive Trait Advisor. So this tool was championed by the International Chamber of Commerce and UNCTAD. It was presented in 2018 at the WTO Public Forum. And it was very much in a pilot phase. And I think it also stayed in this pilot phase. But what's interesting about this tool is the idea that we have highly complex negotiations in trade, which require huge amounts of preparation. For example, in 1950, a typical trade agreement was about 5,000 words long. Today, it's more like 50,000 words long. So there's a huge amount of preparation that needs to happen. How can we facilitate this process? And the cognitive trade advisor basically focuses on specific aspects in trade agreements, in this case, rules of origin, allows for smart searches around this term, allows for focusing on specific countries, specific sectors, and really helps negotiators to be prepared for these types of negotiations much quicker. And here the idea is also to kind of level the playing field between those negotiators that have time and resources to put in this amount of effort and this amount of work, and those who lack the time and resources. So kind of, for example, to level the playing field between developed countries and developing countries. So this in terms of preparation. Then I also want to mention the field of knowledge management. So we have a huge amount of incredibly useful information out there. So what you see here on the screen is, for example, UN Peacemaker, which is a tool by the UN Mediation Support Unit. We have a lot of other tools. So for example, this is the UN Sanctions app. This is UNSC debate. And then last but not least, another example, the humanitarian data exchange. So we have all of these different digital tools that are incredibly useful, but they're not well connected. So future looking on potential uses of AI is really this question of knowledge management, of smart searches that combines different sources of information, different tools to allow people going into a mediation to get a fuller picture, to connect different sets of data in a quicker way, because all of this information is already out there. But the question in a lot of cases is, how do we get a 360 view of the conflict situation that we're going in? So potentially, and I'm not aware of an actual example, but potentially AI tools can connect all these different sources of information and therefore can help giving this 360 view. Third example is about understanding the context and about inclusivity. And here, one of my favorite examples comes from UN Global Pulse. You're probably familiar with them. Another UN agency or UN entity focusing on big data, in particular for humanitarian purposes. The example I want to mention here comes from UN Global Pulse in Kampala. And here the idea was, how do we get a picture of the conversations that are happening in the country? Social media is going to be useful in this case in a very limited way. However, what is a very used and very important communication tool is radio. So people are calling into the radio to talk about certain issues, asked about certain issues, and basically share their opinion and share what's going on in their locality. The tool was developed to kind of better understand migration movements. And in Uganda, you have a lot of radio stations, more than 200, I understand, and also different languages. So what they were doing, they were transcribing speech to text. They were then translating into English, and they were making all this searchable to then get a better idea of what is going on and basically be able to listen and understand the conversations that are going on. Similar tools are also used for greater inclusivity in mediation processes to involve a broader population in the process. And I think Danish is probably going to talk a little bit about that. My last example, kind of a last function of or potential functions of AI tools in the context of mediation is in terms of follow-up and monitoring. The example I have here comes from the environmental sector, but what I want to highlight is there's a huge potential for using of remote sensing, satellite imagery to follow up and monitor agreements. This is not entirely uncontroversial and needs to negotiate it very well, but the potential is there. And actually in this area of image recognition, we have some of the best results when it actually comes to AI applications. But again, this is a little bit future looking and also keeping kind of in mind that the way these tools are integrated into the mediation process needs to be very carefully managed. Looking at the clock, I'm going to do this slide and then quickly wrap up, because I think I've already talked for way too long, but as you can see, there are lots of interesting examples, and I was trying to give you a broad overview. So broadly speaking, AI for mediation, I think there's potential for knowledge management and background research, for generating a good understanding of the mediation context and the parties involved, for greater inclusivity of the process and the broader understanding of the negotiation situation. Then, and I haven't mentioned these tools explicitly, there is potential support in drafting text or summarizing large amounts of text to understand better and be able to process more information. And then last but not least, what I just mentioned, there's potential for implementation, follow-up, and compliance. In the paper Branka mentioned, I make some comments about trust and trust building in the context of mediation and the use of digital tools and artificial intelligence. I'm not going to talk about this now because I think I should give a chance to Danish to share his insights and his very practical applications and interesting tools, but I'm very happy to do that in the Q&A. So please keep that in mind. If this is interesting for you, ask me and I happily share more information. But I'm going to stop here and back to Branka.
Thank you so much, Katarina. This was excellent to get the full picture of what is out there and also what are the potentials. We already touched upon many of these issues and technologies in previous topics. So you can see, actually, this is why we call it an ecosystem, how this is all connected and related, and how you put it at the very beginning. It's not only about using this as a tool, but also understanding the context in which we are working in especially mediators and peacemakers. And of course, we will come back to the trust issue because this is a huge one, especially. I think this is probably this specific element related to peacemaking work when we are talking about emerging technologies. I'm sure Danish will also touch upon this, but this is a great transition now to give floor to you, Danish, and to hear more about DPPA Innovation Unit. We had a chance, and our regular audience had a chance to hear you a couple of times now, including in our latest workshop that Paige mentioned. These were only bits and pieces of information, so we really wanted to give you a chance to tell us more about this amazing work that the Innovation Unit is doing, especially related to mediation. And I advise also the audience to look into your entire portfolio because it's really impressive for those who are interested in emerging technologies. So what your office is trying to do is also look into tools, practices for conflict prevention, mediation, peace building. I like a lot as a user of human-centered design and the practitioner who often was using this methodology. I like the fact that your office is also using this. So maybe you will have a chance to tell us a little bit more why human-centered design is important when we are thinking about using new technologies. I will leave it at this. Danish, feel free to tell us a little bit more about your specific work and the work of your unit, and then let's hear what are these new technologies that you're experimenting with and what can we expect in the future.
First of all, thank you so much, Branka and Paige and Robert for setting this up. Frankly, I'd rather listen to Katarina speak for the rest of the day rather than listen to myself. I'm not fond of hearing my own voice, but under duress, I will try to answer some of the questions that you raised. My name is Danish Masoud Alavi. I help run the DPPA Innovation Cell. Now, DPPA is the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and that's the part of the UN most concerned with bringing armed conflict to an end through preventive diplomacy, mediation, dialogue, talking. We're part of the same sort of broader pillar as our peacekeeping colleagues, the blue helmets that you're familiar with, i.e. troops that go into conflict context to prevent the two sides from fighting. And our colleagues basically provide the security guarantee. That's a lot of what they do. In our case, once there is a security guarantee, either being provided by peacekeepers in the case of a peace operation or by another party, we go in there and we try to mediate between the two sides and engage in preventive diplomacy. We often function on the basis of resolutions from the UN Security Council, and that's the main legislative body that we're kind of responding to, not exclusively, but primarily. And the Security Council is, as all of you know, is the main international body charged with maintaining international peace and security. So it issues resolutions and asks us to be the eyes and ears of the ground, and eyes and ears on the ground in different conflict contexts, and we respond to that. I apologize for boring those of you who know all these things already, but I've noticed that some of you actually aren't, thankfully, not coming from the small world of international peace and security, and come from the broader, wonderful, vibrant, rich universe. And so just a quick primer to ground everything. Now I will share my screen, I think, funny enough, in multiple times, because I have multiple different things that I'd like to show you. And think of this, can you guys see my screen, by the way? Or is it not working? No, not yet. Perhaps not. Screen 2, share. Is it working now? Yes? Great, wonderful. So think of this as a nice picture show with me talking. Really meant to be playful and fun, and not very, very serious at all. And if it gets boring, feel free to do something else. But basically, we're a new shop inside the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. And our job is to pilot new methods, new technologies, new approaches in advancing peace and security work. Sometimes that involves drawing on technology. Sometimes it involves drawing on neuroscience, applied neuroscience and behavioral science. Sometimes it involves using art and storytelling. We do all those things. Okay, now in terms of futuring peace, we think, just to ground our discussion a little bit very quickly, we think it's really important to think in terms of people, systems, and machines, because those are the areas that we're looking to influence, right? And one thing, I think these things are fairly obvious in terms of what the slide says. One thing that I like to stress when I talk about these things to groups like ours today is the aspect of machine behavior, right? And really that machine behavior is now becoming an interesting field in and of itself. In other words, organizations, companies like Facebook, for instance, write algorithms, let's say, and the goal, or those algorithms are optimized in order to maximize engagement of users of specific types of content. They're written in a certain way with certain things in mind, and then they're put out into the world and they behave independently, almost like a person would behave. And those independent behaviors of these algorithms, or sets of algorithms, then interact with our independent behaviors, right? And that has all kinds of unforeseen consequences. For instance, what happens when misinformation spreads through certain types of content. And the classic example that one can turn to here is, of course, what happened in Myanmar with the Rohingya tragedy. So machine behaviors is going to be an interesting field to go deeper into, and that would be something that I'd love to talk to Katerina over lunch. Branka mentioned, how do we function? We try to be interdisciplinary. We believe in collaborating with the public sector as well as the private sector. Of course, we live and die by the use case. And so what I mean when I say that is basically, we don't really fetishize technology or a particular approach or applied neuroscience or art or storytelling. Our goal is to listen very, very closely to what the needs of our colleagues on the ground are in a conflict context and respond to that in the best way possible. And really that starts by, engaging in almost like a kind of ethnography to understand what the particular issue, what the particular workflow they're trying to affect or influence is. Obviously design thinking, I think all of you, I'm guessing on the call, are familiar with design thinking and design thinking processes. I won't go into too much, but basically what I just described is the method we follow. We have a number of work streams, and I'm going to go into them, but they include a lot of what Katerina touched on earlier. Geospatial analytics using space-based imagery, combining that with machine vision, computer vision. I'm occasionally speaking in short form here, so as to not bore you and to not have this become a tech talk. But basically, we use all types of technology, and we're somewhat agnostic, and the reach is pretty wide. Now, I want to talk about specifically the challenge, the questions we talked about, right? Which is, how do we systematically dialogue with and pull constituencies in conflict contexts, right? With this underlying theory of change we have, right? Our theory of change is in order for a peace agreement or a political process, when conflict is ongoing or waning, basically when people are talking, finally engaging in dialogue. Our theory of change is that the more inclusive you make it, the more likely it is to last. That's our theory of change here, right? And so with that theory of change in mind, how do we systematically talk to people, dialogue with them, poll them in a way that's cheap, that's efficient, that's maximally inclusive, that is in their specific language, that's not in some language that only the elite speak, let's say French or English or what have you. And so that's the problem we set out to solve. Now, we started looking at natural language processing, which is at the intersection of computation and linguistics. And basically, it involves teaching computers to understand how human language works. Now, the problem here is that there aren't that many resources that we can use off the shelf for the contexts we work in. In other words, in conflicts like Libya or Yemen, where people speak Yemeni dialect Arabic or Libyan dialect Arabic, there is no way for us to just pull on some kind of existing resource to train computers to understand those things. And so we went about doing that, and we basically developed a way for us to speak, engage in a large-scale dialogue using a simple JavaScript-based platform, using people's smartphones and computers, where everyone who's part of the dialogue feels that they're talking to one person, right? But in fact, there are 1,000 people in the room. And what this does is allow us to do both, basically a kind of a focus group without the problems that are inherent in a focus group methodology, such as sampling biases or behavioral contagion, but at the scale of a survey. And of course, that involves multiple choice questions. It involves open form, like free form questions where people can answer freely. What the AI, and I don't love that term, but basically what the computer infrastructure in the background does is it understands what people are saying and clusters things that are similar to each other together, and then poses that back to them and says, is this what you mean? And they say yes or no. And then it also asks them, the other people that are in this room that are talking to us are saying these things. Do you agree or disagree? And thereby, you can establish levels of consensus or consensus scores on specific points of view regarding a fairly polarizing issue in the context of a political process in Libya or in Yemen, for example, both places where we've deployed this technology. At the same time, the other interesting part of this is that you see, we want to be able to understand what different demographic groups are saying, right? Based on the fact that different groups have different views in a conflict context. In Libya, for instance, you have the East, the West, and the South. And so we ask people at scale to self-identify through onboarding polls at the beginning of the conversation. And then we can then use that segmentation as the conversation is progressing to see in real time what the points of agreement or disagreement are between the various groups that exist in the conflict context. And we can, that is very helpful, because in real time, then we can drill down and better understand what people are basically what people are feeling and what they're thinking. Now, here, one crucial thing to highlight is that it's really important as the UN, as the organization involved in running a dialogue or mediation process, for there to be a there. In other words, what people say to us, when people talk to us, they entrust us with their views. They entrust us by giving us, they put their trust in us by giving us their time, right? And what they tell us, we have to be able to show to them that we use that, and we use that to influence and inform the political and peace process. I'm showing you pictures of Yemen and Libya as part of my nice picture show where we deployed this technology. In Libya in particular, I feel that we really used it in earnest in order to support the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum, where between October 2020 and January 2021, we deployed this technology on 5 separate occasions. And it was moderated by Stephanie Williams, who was the acting SRSG and the most senior UN person, basically overseeing the mediation process, the dialogue process. And that was extremely helpful in terms of increasing people's purchase of the idea of the political process. In terms of what I was saying earlier, the need for there to be a there, like for people to really feel that what they're saying matters. Just one example of that is that before the interim authority was selected in Libya prior to elections that hopefully will take place this year on Christmas Eve, the question we posed to them is, what would you like to ask the candidates? They gave us their questions as part of a real-time large-scale synchronous dialogue in which 1,000 people participated. And then we took those questions and posed those questions to those who were running for the interim government authority on live television. Not only this, one of the, if you see in the bottom right corner, one of the dialogues was actually broadcast on live satellite Libyan TV with commentary, which is fascinating because it was almost like a sports event. Again, these are just images of some of the things we did. I know I'm running short on time and I only have a minute left, according to at least our pre-agreed run of show. And maybe I'll turn to Branka and Paige to tell me if I have a little more time, because I'd like to maybe talk about one other speculative project that involves building a negotiation space in virtual reality. But if not, I'll leave that for questions because I know I'm almost at time and I want to honor what my hosts have asked of me. So I can pause here, you tell me.
Thank you, Danish. Well, while we are maybe inviting audience to start typing their comments and questions and collecting this, I would actually like to give you a couple of more minutes to tell us, because I know this is a new project and element of your work that you are working on about this virtual reality and how potentially peacemakers can use this element in enhancing their work. So take a couple of more minutes, Danish. If you are sharing your screen again, I don't know if you can try to share it in a full, or if this is already a full screen. We are seeing it a little bit smaller, but go ahead and tell us a little bit more about this completely new addition to your work. And for the audience, please feel free to start typing your comments and questions for our speakers. Thank you, Danish.
Thank you so much, Branka, for being so generous. And I'll say, just guys, before I jump into the whole VR side of things, feel free to ask me about automated speech recognition, which we're also working on. Feel free to ask me about mining social media data and radio and television data, as well as the deployment of machine vision and computer vision with satellite imagery. I'm just flagging those things for those who might be interested in talking about this. So basically, what's the idea here? The big idea here is, how do we build a negotiation space in an immersive VR environment that allows negotiation parties to talk to each other, and for mediators to talk to them, for mediators and parties to prepare for negotiations, and to run simulations of what the different outcomes might be if people take different positions. It's kind of a kooky idea at the very edge of what's possible, and that's part of what we're supposed to do in the innovation cell, right? It's not easy in a kind of conservative sclerotic bureaucracy, but we're trying to do that. So in this context, we created this thing, and basically I should add here very quickly that obviously COVID was one of the contextual important factors that parties couldn't meet, but it's not just COVID. In the context of the Syria negotiations, as many of you know, things were so polarized that there were only proximity talks, right? Multiple instances of that, because parties just don't want to face each other, right? So is this interesting? And then aside from all of that, when it comes to programs that train mediators like at ETH Zurich, right? This could be potentially very, very interesting. So how do we basically play around in VR to get people to prepare? And this particular idea around the 6 thinking hats is more oriented around preparing the mediator and preparing the conflict parties, getting them to think in different ways about emotion regulation and cognitive reappraisal in the context of conflict resolution. And so this is virtual reality as a mood induction tool, right? So you enter a space, you can choose different hats depending on what you're feeling, right? Are you thinking about the future? Are you feeling intuitive? Are you feeling cautious? Are you feeling creative? Whatever that is, right? And so we can use these types of things to prepare a mediator and prepare parties to think about what are some of the things that they're not thinking about. Now, it's not just this. I want to show you one other quick screen share, and I promise then I'll stop talking and I'll start thinking about questions and stuff. Is like, how can we reinvent negotiations? How can we use this opportunity to reinvent negotiations in interesting ways? So what people often think of yes, no, maybe there's a kind of use for democratic tableware that's multisensory, that allows you to express your level of agreement with what's being proposed, right? In addition to that people can play around with. In addition to that, you can also play around with sensory substitution and sensory augmentation in virtual reality through the use of haptics in order to signal levels of agreement, in order to signal discord, in order to signal all kinds of things. Basically, the idea being to use the very cutting edge of haptics, neuroscience, applied neuroscience, in-group, out-group dynamics, and what immersive spaces allow in order to really augment the negotiations experience in an immersive environment. And there are lots of really out there ideas, but these are just some of them. And I'll pause there since my time is really up now. So I'll stop the share, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I'm happy to go in more detail into things that I just checked off and rattled off in order to not take up more time. Back to you, Branka.
Thank you, Danish and Katarina. This was really interesting, and there are many questions to ask, especially if you broaden conversation, Danish, to data mining and social media data and so on, which I think is also a very important topic, the entire social media and mediation, and then in combination with different artificial intelligence tools and so on. So I actually want to start with the first question from the audience. And I think this comes very often into this discussion. How do we think about benefiting from these tools in the areas that have actually, and I will maybe add to this, the person who is asking the question is asking about limited to no connectivity areas. I think we often ask this question either from I'm an optimist or I'm a pessimist side of the story. So optimists will say more and more people are getting connectivity, and we have more and more users, especially on the young user side of the story. So there is a potential to hear young voices, for example, Danish and Katarina, and some of the tools that you were mentioning in hearing the thoughts and opinions of people and citizens. But you can ask the same question from the other side, right? Like, no, we actually have a 50% of population who are not included. So how do we balance? Is there a way to balance or to allow more inclusivity of people who are not connected or even don't have electricity, which happens many times in the areas we are working in?
Okay, I can start by perhaps sharing a few thoughts, and then I'm sure Danish has a bit more. Also some practical examples. So in general, of course, that's a huge problem. I mean, when I looked at AI applications in the area of development cooperation and humanitarian action, a lot of these tools sounded really great, but really depended on an internet connection. And then you often had like a footnote saying, and we're trying to develop this for use off the grid. And you're like, okay, so we have a pilot of this tool, but it's not actually usable in a lot of contexts. So the first practical point I want to make is we need to have this inclusivity. We can't just focus on people who are already connected. The example I shared from you in Global Pulse regarding listening to radio conversations in Uganda is perhaps a good example where this is very much respected, that how do you listen to people? How do you include people? How do you include their voices when they don't have internet connectivity, when they're not on social media? And for a long time, we've seen this focus on social media, emotion recognition, discussion and analysis on social media. And really, it's not just in countries with lower connectivity where we're missing parts of the conversation when we only focus on social media. The other point I want to make, and this is perhaps more future looking, is that the conversation tool that Danish described, I can very much imagine this in the future also including the possibility, for example, for calling in via radio or having different forms of actually accessing the tools that do not require internet connectivity. But the bottom line is when we talk about digital tools, this is still a limit, and perhaps it's something inbuilt. But I'm curious to see what others think.
Just jumping in quickly, building on what Katarina said, really we have to pay attention to what the context is, right? And really understand what is the level of internet penetration, but not just this, what are the social practices around internet use here? What is the gender dimension, right? These are all really, really vital things to ask. Now, the platform we use is very, very low bandwidth, and we tend to test it on the 3G networks of the country involved, right? So in the case of Yemen, even in the far-flung areas on the very border with Saudi Arabia, we were able to get people, which was wonderful and not entirely expected. It was a nice surprise. But all this to say, we have a huge responsibility in order to make sure that the views we're talking about are representative, right? So I'm going to go maybe a little bit deeper into the question and say, how do we make sure that the views that are being talked about are actually representative? And in that regard, one of the things that's super important is that we have a baseline sample that's been put together by a national polling company, which is what we did in Libya, by the way, so that we have a sense of what the key demographics are. And then we look at the sample that we got through our real-time large-scale synchronous dialogue online using this AI-assisted dialogue tool and renormalize it and reweight it on the basis of the baseline sample. I know this is getting a little bit granular and in the weeds and wonky, but it's also important to say that, right? Now, in addition, what does the future look like in this regard? Indeed, exactly as Katarina has said, we're working with speech-to-text technology. We're also, funny enough, working on WhatsApp integration. We found in the case of certain conflict contexts that we're working on, most people tend to have WhatsApp on their smartphone. That is the extent of their cell phone plan, right? They have calls and they have WhatsApp, or they'll have calls, WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, or calls and Facebook Messenger. So that means we need to find a way to integrate with that. We also need to find a way to take advantage of the native functionality of voice to text on WhatsApp, et cetera. So, and indeed, exactly as Katerina has said, we're working on automated speech recognition with radio as well, where we're teaching computers to understand and transcribe Arabic dialects from radio and TV content, and then subject it to all kinds of summarization and analysis using natural language processing tools. For those of you who are tech heads, we're experimenting with GPT-3, we're experimenting with Hugging Face transformers and other PyTorch libraries there. Back to you guys.
Thank you both. Well, I have an immediate quick question to both of you, and Katarina and I actually spend a lot of time talking about this DPT-3 technology and so on. And Danish, I know how much your department and your partners actually invented energy and resources into the tools that are translating Arabic language and even working in the dialects. Are we actually talking about having just a sample of this work that will never be able to be scaled? I'm just thinking, how much energy do we need to invest to be able to develop these kind of tools for other languages or even other dialects? Is this something that we can potentially think about? How complicated is this, Danish? You can tell us internally, maybe this is not a secret, how complicated this was, because we are also thinking about different parts of the region. We do see, at least I see the benefits, especially when we talk about dialects, of really making sure that people are heard in their own language, in the way how they can express themselves. So this is maybe the first part of the question to Danish, and then the second to Katarina on DPT-3. Also, both of you can relate to this one, and all of the risks that this community is pointing related to natural language or big language models, how we call them, and all of the biases that are out there that is actually AI community pointing to. So are we keeping up as a peace building community to all of the risks that are coming with these tools as well?
So just to save time, I'll jump in really quick and say that, first of all, the important thing with any of these issues is to bring more people to the party, right? And to say, look, we don't have a lot of money, but the cause that we represent is very important, and maybe you want to be part of this, right? And we need to do that, right? And we do, I'm presenting it in a silly, jovial way, but really we have to do it in a very serious and earnest way with researchers, with universities, with technology companies. In the case of the large-scale dialogue tool, the company we collaborate with gave us their IP, which is worth, God knows, hundreds of millions of dollars for free. And it's in black and white, it's in an agreement, right? And that's really important, right? And that's kind of unprecedented, you know. Good luck trying to do that with Google or Microsoft or Amazon, right? That's probably not going to happen. But if you know a medium-sized company that has a visionary founder or CEO who has some control still, and it hasn't grown too big, and they're very interested in preventive diplomacy and peacemaking, maybe you have a chance, right? So we try to find the appropriate partner. Of course, a big part of this is also signaling to the research community. This problem is unsolved. There's no market reason to solve this problem. There is a peacemaking reason, however, and we will use it, and we can design it with you, and we can connect you to the people on the ground that would use it. Very interesting use case. I think I can raise money from foundations and get more grants to do this kind of research with you, United Nations. Interesting, right? So that approach. Now into the specifics of what you're saying. Indeed, Branka, this work is tough because you have to build an annotated corpus. Again, I always check myself with my text speak, but basically think of it as building a dictionary, and it's hard, right? Building a dictionary with between 25 and 40,000 unique terms in dialect, not so easy. Takes years of investment, but it's foundational investment that's worth it, right? And so we've done that with 5 Arabic dialects. But you don't have to just use this kind of semantic web language-based approach. You can also use statistical methods, where the computer begins to see how certain things are more likely to be similar, or it can be clustered into one sort of cloud of meaning, let's say, right? And so indeed, what we have here works in 5 Arabic dialects. It works in about 22 other languages. Currently, we can talk to 1,000 people in real time. By the year end, we'll be able to talk to 10,000 people in real time, right? So there's really an opportunity for scale here. Yeah, I think I'll pause there. Over to Katerina.
Thank you so much. I want to pick up on one point, which is this collaboration with the tech sector, which is a huge issue especially when we're dealing in sensitive context with sensitive data. And when we go back to where we started our conversation with the pandemic, the question then became: so we have those proprietary platforms like Zoom, yet public entities are using these platforms for their work. So diplomats are using Zoom and WhatsApp. What does it mean? What does it mean for in this context? What are the challenges? And I think one important point to emphasize is that it's really crucial that parliaments, but also the United Nations and governments invest in tools that are acting more like public spaces. That are designed with certain values at the core, which are not necessarily related to a specific business model, to a specific type of engagement. And so, for example, the work of the Innovation Cell is really important in this, but I think the question is also much broader. Who designs these tools, with what intentions, with what business model, with what drive behind them? Second point, let me add some reflections on GPT-3. So GPT-3 is basically a tool that can automatically write text, to put it very simply. Based on an input, it generates text. And the way it was discussed in the media was, oh my God, so now we no longer need journalists because here we have this tool that writes a text very, very perfectly with very little input. So there was, for example, an article in The Guardian where this view was a little bit promoted. Turns out this article was actually highly edited, in the sense that several versions were produced using GPT-3 and then put together in a sense that then the whole piece in itself was coherent and was meaningful. Because what this tool struggles with is to create this kind of coherence and meaningfulness across paragraphs for a whole text. That's basically not possible. I think this is basically not possible with traditional machine learning tools. A lot of researchers seem to be saying that for that, we need to go into a different area of AI that combines machine learning and what is called symbolic AI. The other point perhaps for GPT-3 is also questions around its environmental impact, because the huge amounts of data that are used to train these tools also have a real life footprint, an environmental footprint, which even if we have the money and the technological resources to develop more and more of these tools, this other side of the coin is something we need to take in. And related to that, of course, discussions around ethics and bias As always, whatever you feed into the tool is kind of coming out of the tool. So there are huge concerns about ethics and bias and really the limits of what tools like GPT-3 that are a little bit hyped, the limits of these tools. That's a conversation we need to have.
Thank you both, and I'm being aware of the time as well. It's easy to lose track with so many interesting points. We received a lot of questions, so I would maybe invite both of you to leave your contact details, or how can audience actually get in touch with you and maybe continue conversation with some of these topics. I do want to bring another quick question and then ask for a quick answer from you, because I think this is a really important conversation that we also need to have. And this is local population, and a member of our audience is asking how and when do you ask for a consent of local populations and civil society to employ high-level technology. I'm bringing another question that we got from the audience in advance regarding the trust. So this is not only a trust towards your organization supplying this, but even trust in a machine. Do we trust these machines to do things that we employ them to do? So this is a sort of a quick just response from you, and also maybe the last concluding words that you have. What do we need to think about when we are thinking about future employment of these technologies in peacemaking and mediation?
Let me start perhaps really quickly, especially focusing on trust. So first of all, you always ask permission and make it very transparent of what kind of tools you use. But on trust, I would never say, let's trust the technology. I would say, let's build a process which allows us to very clearly see how the technology was developed, at each step, what decisions were taken regarding the algorithm, the data, and the use in a specific context. Let's have auditing, transparency, accountability. So I think the word trust in itself is a little bit misleading. It's about how we design the processes around these tools. It's not about trusting these tools, I think, ever. But let me also say a little bit about the context of mediation, because that's what I find really interesting, because trust or lack of trust in the tools used might have ramifications of how mediators, how peacemakers are perceived. That's why it needs to be managed extremely carefully. But perhaps on a positive note, and going back to local populations, I think if we design a process where everyone feels like they have a stake and a say and are integrated, it is imaginable to use these tools to actually create more trust by kind of creating what I call a working trust between the parties involved, kind of involving them in building the tools and making key decisions about the tools. And then in doing so, we potentially have a tool that might work really well in implementation and follow-up, because it's based on this working trust in the process and therefore in each other, and not the technology itself.
Agree as always with Katarina, and building on that, from the perspective of a practitioner, really, I think a level of transparency as to what our problems are and what we're trying to solve for, and inviting others to be part of that. Right. So in the case of, there wasn't a systematic way for us to pull in dialogue with peace constituencies in conflict contexts, right? How do we solve for that in a way that doesn't involve spending $300,000 every 3 months with Gallup or some other polling company and getting a static survey back, right? The answers aren't always easy, right? In our case, of course, everything is anonymous with this tool that we're using, so we don't really have a way of following up with those who participate. But still, we have their trust, right? And we, of course, share with them precisely what we're going to do with the data, how it's going to be used, and all those things as part of the dialogue. But really, going back to what I said earlier, a level of transparency and using that as a way to work on what the issues are. And then finally, another point I made earlier, which is really machine behavior. Now, this isn't just, this isn't just about the peacemaking field. It's about how platforms get designed, right? Facebook is designed in a certain way. The Windows OS, the iOS from Apple or whatever, Zoom in order to encourage certain types of behaviors, in order for you to revisit certain neuronal pathways over and over again and form different types of ways of engaging with information. Instagram, we all know this, right? But I think having an awareness around machine behavior and how machine behavior affects society is going to become very, very important. And that applies, of course, to those of us working in the peacemaking or peace building field that is at the intersection of technology. But even more so, I think this is a bigger question around the future of what multilateral organizations in the UN Security Council look like. Specifically, as warfare becomes more and more algorithmic, we're going to have conversations about how those algorithms are being written and designed and what they're optimizing for. And this is something that the UN could potentially, and in particular the Security Council and the Peace and Security pillar, need to begin preparations for.
Thank you both so much. I think this was a great conclusion, really thinking about the big system as well. Thank you, Danish, for emphasizing that this is not only about peacemaking or peacekeeping field. It's really important to look into the broader system, but it's also about what our field can bring maybe to this system. So this is why we really started the dialogues, and thank you both for joining us, for sharing your work and your experiences with us. Thank you to the audience. Please, both Danish and Katarina, have a look still at the questions, some amazing questions, Danish, on neuroscience. This is, I think, another discussion we will have to have just around this. It's super important to dedicate time to be aware of what waits for us in the future. Thank you, everybody, once again. Thanks for joining us, and join us again every last Tuesday in a month. We are organizing our Data for Peace dialogue, and of course, join our LinkedIn group. I always mention this as a way to stay in touch and to keep sharing about your impressive work. Thank you all.
Thanks, Branka. Thanks, Danish and Katarina. Bye, everyone.